Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Hi, DA, Cecilia, Mary Ann. Today we have a great show. Paul Vangelisi was going to lead off, but he's not here. So what we'll do, we'll just go with the regular order. And if Paul comes along, we'll put him at the end. So we'll start with Cecilia Woloch, DA Powell, and then Mary Ann. Today we are going to answer the question, what is the central thrust of modern American poetry in the 20th century up to the time you began writing poetry in a serious, regular way? As an invocation, I will read a few lines from one of my favorite epics in the 20th century, Letter to an Imaginary Friend by Thomas McGrath. It was good singing, that silence, from the riches of common work, the solidarity of forlorn men, firm on our margins of poverty and cold. Communitas, holy city, laughter at 40 below, round song, the chime of comradeship that comes once maybe in the winter of the blue snow. That's how it was. Cecilia Woloch is an American poet and writer, the author of 6 collections of poems and a novel. Her honors include a fellowship from the NEA, a Pushcart Prize, and inclusion in the Best American Poetry. She spent the last years on a Fulbright Fellowship in southeastern Poland. Here's Cecilia Woloch.
Thank you, Harry. It's a pleasure to be here with poets whose work I love. D.A. Powell, I haven't met you before virtually or in person, but it's an honor to be here with you. Mary Ann McFadden knows I love her poems and I love her, as I love Harry. So I have been thinking about this question for the past couple of weeks, and I made myself a lot of notes, mostly while I was in Krakow this afternoon drinking mulled wine, because it's very, very cold here. So mulled wine is one of the ways we get through the winter. I just 10 minutes ago got rushed back into my apartment in Rzeszów. Rzeszów is near the Ukrainian border. We're about 50 miles from the Ukrainian border, and Vladimir Zelensky has named us the savior city of Ukraine. So that's where I'm at. And Harry's question, the question I initially got was, well, he said I would have 12 minutes, I'm counting, to answer the question of what was the central thrust, or what is the central thrust of modern American poetry up to the time when you began writing poetry in a serious way. So I could get hung up on any number of points in that question. One being, I'm not sure if I can pinpoint when I began writing poetry in a serious way. My best guess would be at age 16, if you can call a 16-year-old serious. I don't know. I like the answer I think William Stafford gave once, and somebody asked him, when did you start writing poetry? And he said, when did everybody else stop? So I was one of those teenagers who started writing poetry and didn't stop. By the time I started writing poetry, I had loved poetry already for a long time. I had a mother who read aloud to me and my siblings, and in addition to poems from children's books, she would read poems by Edgar Allan Poe, because that's the kind of mom she was. And she loved Edgar Allan Poe and the horror movies that were made from his stories. But The Raven and Annabel Lee were poems I was familiar with early, and the main impression I had about poetry then was that poetry was musical. Poetry was something between speaking and singing. My mother also sang a lot, so that line between speaking and singing was pretty blurred. In the 6th grade and then in junior high, I had teachers who offered extra credit for memorizing and reciting poems, something I discovered I could easily do and get extra credit, although I sometimes did it in a very smart alecky way. My teachers were good-natured and they gave me the credit anyway. I think I was really just covering up how seriously I felt those poems, pretending not to be moved when I read them out loud by reading them in a really melodramatic way. And the first poems I remember reciting in school were not American poems. They were Christina Rossetti's A Birthday, Robert Burns' My Heart's in the Highlands. Although somewhere along the way, I remember hearing also Casey at the Bat and Richard Cory. Okay, these were wonderful to me. Probably my mother read them to me, maybe my father. I liked them a lot because they used language that was familiar to me, but it was also rhythmic, and they also told stories. In high school, I was first exposed to Emily Dickinson's poems, Hope is a Thing with Feathers, and to poems by Robert Frost, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening and A Road Less Traveled. And these poems, I really loved the way they sounded, but they seemed to be trying to teach me something. So while I liked their music, I didn't like them as much as I liked some other poems because I didn't want to be taught anything. They didn't inspire that kind of feeling in me that things like the Christina Rossetti poem did or the Robert Burns. Then I got to high school and I went to Bullitt Central High School, which is a rural high school in Kentucky, which is one of the lowest ranked states in public education. And I had teachers that I've never had better teachers since, including a speech and drama teacher who had us reading Aristotle and Ibsen. And we had a speech and debate team, and we could compete in the poetry category by reading things like Sylvia Plath's Daddy. And this was mind-blowing. I don't think any of us really understood it. I'm not sure I still completely understand it, but what we got was its fierceness, its rage, and we also got to say, "You bastard," out loud in school. So I love that. And I think that was my first inkling that poetry could be really transgressive. We also were reading a lot of plays with monologues that sounded like poems to me. I remember memorizing a monologue from A Doll's House and Tennessee Williams monologues. They sounded like poems to me. So I also started to see that poetry could be a really blurry thing. You know, it could be kind of badass. It could be blurry. It could be musical. It could tell stories. And it was something that could like sneak in through doors that weren't necessarily marked poetry. The fact that this kind of literature that I got exposed to in high school dealt with themes that seemed not only adult to me, but subversive, I really loved that. And my classmates did too. It was the 70s and we were ready to rebel against anything. I had my first creative writing teacher, Ms. B, at Bullitt Central. She taught a class called Modern Song and Verse. We were allowed to bring in our guitars and our records and to talk about the lyrics of songs as poems. Miss B especially loved Bob Dylan and Willie Nelson. We read Eliot's Proof Rock and Edgar Lee Masters' Spoon River Anthology. And this woman, this tiny little woman who wore blue high heels, subscribed to the Atlantic Monthly for us rural kids so that we could read the contemporary poems that were being published in the Atlantic Monthly. And that's where I first read Anne Sexton. And the first poem I read by Lucille Clifton, which really changed everything for me. It's a poem called Miss Rosie. I'm going to leave myself a minute to read it at the end. It was fierce and it was defiant, and its subject was a woman I could recognize, a woman not that different from some of the women around me, although they were white. So by the time I was 16, I had taken all of this in. I had read and recited a fair amount of poetry in English. It was something that was, I read on the page, but it always moved from the page to the voice. I had absorbed its rhythms and its cadences. I had figured out that language alone, all by itself, could make a kind of music. I had discovered that a poem could tell a story. And then the most amazing thing was reading Lucille Clifton's Miss Rosie showed me that poetry could be written about anything. And it could sound just like a human voice. And it could be a woman's voice, and it could be angry, and it could be fierce, and it could be how I felt. And I learned that poetry was powerful, not because it could start revolutions, although that seemed possible too, but because it could make things happen in words that couldn't happen any other way. The speaker of Miss Rosie says at the end, "Through your destruction, I stand up." So that was the poem that really made me want to write poetry seriously. I felt serious about poetry by 16. I felt serious about trying to do that thing that poets could do with language. But I'm not sure I had an idea of what the central thrust of American poetry was. But I was trying to hitch a ride on a lineage that seemed glorious to me, seemed more and more like a force to me. In college, I met my first living published poet, Carolyn Kaiser. She was statuesque and blonde and hell on wheels, and I wanted to grow up to be her. I had already read her poems and a lot of poems by other contemporary women poets in anthologies. I checked out of the college library over and over again until my boyfriend bought me my own copies. No More Masks and Rising Tides. Those were the two anthologies. I first encountered Whitman in college, I think, but I can't say for sure because Whitman seems to have always been there. In LA in the 80s, I got involved with the punk scene and found Beyond Baroque and the poetry of Charles Bukowski and Wanda Coleman, which seemed to me to extend the lineage of American poetry. Wanda's poetry was incantational. Bukowski's poetry was often narrative. Their poetry was explosive and what we might call confessional, but I'd call witnessing. And it dared to go further and further in terms of subject matter and language than the poets who came before them had gone. And then I went on to study in LA with Jack Grapes, who taught and wrote with the real Whitman-esque passion, who was passionate about real American speech, about Whitman's project and William Carlos Williams to make poems that were in an American English. Jack Grapes was good about exposing us to poets in translation especially from Central and South America, those poets who were making these great and bold imaginative leaps. And then I came to study with Holly Prado, which is when my most serious and rigorous education as a poet began. It was in Holly's workshop that I first engaged in the struggle with the poems of Wallace Stevens and H.D., who would become one of my guiding lights and whose poems I still deliciously don't fully grasp. And so it was under Holly's tutelage that I realized I wanted to write beyond anything I already understood. I wanted to enter the mystery of language in the service of a deep dive into the self, into the mystery of the self, or vice versa, or both. And so I've come to see the central thrust of American poetry as this. It's the poetry of witness. We're bearing witness not so much, we're not exclusively to historical events, but to the self in the midst of those events, the amalgamation of selves. I'm reading the great Belarusian writer Svetlana Alexievich now, and she writes, "I am a historian of the soul." And Holly Prado said, "Poets are makers. We're makers of our souls." And I think the central project of American poetry is the making of an American soul. Do I have a minute to read Miss Rosie, Harry? It's not even a minute. It's really short.
Go ahead, please.
Okay. Miss Rosie by Lucille Clifton. When I watch you wrapped up like garbage, sitting surrounded by the smell of 2 old potato peels, or when I watch you in your old man's shoes with a little toe cut out, sitting, waiting for your mind like next week's groceries. I say, when I watch you, you wet brown bag of a woman who used to be the best looking gal in Georgia, used to be called the Georgia Rose, I stand up. Through your destruction, I stand up.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Our next poet is D.A. Powell. D.A. Powell is the author of 5 collections, including Useless Landscape or A Guide for Boys, which received the National Book Critics Circle Award in Poetry. His honors include the Kingsley Tufts Prize in Poetry and the Shelley Memorial Prize from the Poetry Society of America. His poems focus on environment, place, love, and mortality. A former Briggs Copeland lecturer at Harvard, Powell has taught at Columbus University, Stanford, University of Iowa, and for the past 17 years, University of San Francisco, where he drives the administration crazy. Here's D.A. Powell.
Thank you, Harry. And Cecilia, it was wonderful to get to hear your sort of poetic bibliography of the South, because we share a lot of similarities in our development. Particularly, I was a drama student before I was ever considered writing poetry. I wanted to be a playwright. And so, when you were talking about how Tennessee Williams's monologues feel like poems, or Shakespeare, or Ibsen, I really think that was one of the first things that helped me to understand poetry, was that poetry, not always, but can often be a kind of interior monologue. And the exciting part of that is that there's a listener implied in the poem. It doesn't have to be just the person who is reading the poem on the page, but somebody else who's sort of indicated by the structure of the poem. But I read poems in classes in high school, and they were always by dead poets. And they always had that kind of dead poet feel to them, meaning there was some lesson, some embedded pedagogical reason why we were reading this poem, for historical information, for representation of an art period or an idea. And it really, I felt like poetry often left me sort of numb and unchanged. But I was always watching plays on PBS, and on Great Performances one night, there was this show by a director named Vinette Carroll. I have it on DVD. It's called When Hell Freezes Over, I'll Skate. And it says very modestly on the back that it includes poetry of Langston Hughes, County Cullen, and others. But essentially what this was a staged reading of many poems by African-American poets. one of which was a poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar. The poem is entitled Antebellum Sermon. And the voicing of the poem is such that the poem is being spoken by a pastor of a Black church prior to the Civil War. And he's teaching the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of captivity and into the Promised Land. And he finds it necessary to pause in the middle of his sermon to say, lest anyone should go and tell the master that I'm preaching insurrection, I want to remind you that I'm talking about biblical times, not today. And there was all of this sort of rhetorical structure that was embedded in the poem. And it fascinated me that, he could be talking to two audiences simultaneously. One, which was receiving the message of Moses will come and lead us out of this captivity, and the other audience, which was, listening for the preacher to step over the bounds and go and report it. And so he's, kind of walking this very fine line. And it ends with him cutting off the sermon in the midst of his building up to, one of these days, this is what's going to happen. And he can see that, some of his listeners are getting riled up in the wrong way. And he says, children, let us pray. And he cuts off the poem. So I went looking for that poem, which is silly. I lived in a very small town. We had one bookstore that was in a mall, the Peachtree Mall in Linda, California. And it was kind of like looking for a needle in a haystack. And yet this small town bookstore had a section of poetry that was about this big. It was about as big as a Zoom meeting. And I went along the spines of the shelves, and I found this, The Black Poets by Dudley Randall. And I started flipping through it. And sure enough, I found the poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar. And not only that, I found all these other poems. I was like, wow, living people are still writing poems too. That was news to me. And I was excited by the kind of offhand manner of poetry, the way in which poetry could simply be a thought. It didn't have to be a complex speech. It didn't have to be many things all tied together. This is a poem by a poet named John Raven. I don't know whatever happened to John Raven. He published maybe one book. But this was the kind of poetry that set my imagination on fire. This is called The Roach. A roach came strutting across my bedroom floor like it was beyond reproach or was some sexy looking whore. And if I hadn't snuffed it, left it alive, I know it would have come right up and slapped me 5. And here's another one from the same anthology. This is by Mari Evans. And again, the poem just captures a mood. It's called Where Have You Gone? I thought I could write poems like this. And maybe my first poems were attempts at being this good. Where have you gone? With your confident walk, with your crooked smile. Why did you leave me when you took your laughter and departed? Are you aware that with you went the sun, all light, and what few stars there were? Where have you gone with your confident walk, your crooked smile, the rent money in one pocket, and my heart in the other? So all of a sudden I was excited by poetry. I wrote some poems. I too was in speech and debate. There was a category called original prose and poetry. And my debate coach insisted that I should compete in that category. Well, I was always sort of a contrary lad. And I decided to write poems that would get me excused from having to do the assignment. So I wrote all in one night, a collection of poems called Fun and Death. And they were all poems about defecation, maggots, anything that I could think of that was gross. And my debate coach read through the poem. She said, "This is horrible. This is horrible. You can't do this." And I was like, okay. And then I think I didn't play my hand that well, because she saw that that was my goal, was to get excused. And so she made me get up and compete with these poems. And I actually did pretty good. I got like third place for that tournament. I probably would have done better if I hadn't started laughing in the middle of my speech, because I was just so amused by my own dirtiness. But that little bit of encouragement then led me later to take poetry classes. And I was lucky that my first poetry teacher was somebody who was very permissive. He was David Bromwich. He had grown up in the British public school system, so he knew all of the canonical stuff. But then he immigrated to the United States via Vancouver, Canada in the 1960s, where he became friends with Robert Greeley, Jack Spicer, Denise Levertov, and the gang of what constitutes one wing of the outsider version of American art.
And he was a high school teacher?
He was a college teacher at Sonoma.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I was able, he was permissive enough to let me write whatever the hell I wanted. And I think that that's what saved me. I didn't have much taste in poetry. I mean, I liked all kinds of poetry. And I think what I liked about American poetry in particular was that there was this ability to kind of abstract and mythologize the South. That was even sort of, that was a trope that occurred a lot, particularly in West Coast poetry, because the West Coast was sort of turning its back on the East Coast, which really was a kind of stodgy, formal kind of poetry. And then something else that we used to refer to as the school of quietude. Those poems that make you go, hmm. And we didn't want to write anything like that. We wanted to write poems that made people go, ah! That were electrifying and challenging. Ginsberg was our idol. I found this book. This was one of the first poetry books I ever owned. It was published by Andrei Codrescu. It's a compilation of poems by this guy, Jeffrey Miller, who lived up on the Russian River and died in an automobile accident. And his poetry was just sort of, no holds barred, take no prisoners, careening through the night air, crashing into everything around him. And I feel like that was the kind of American poetry that I wanted to write. I have just one more poem to share. And this is a poem that since I've been working at University of San Francisco, I've been teaching courses on California poetry and San Francisco poetics. And so I'm constantly in a state of rediscovering poetry, and rediscovering poetry, not just by poets, but by ordinary people. This poem is one of the hundreds of poems that is carved in the windows at Angel Island, which was an immigration and detention center for Chinese immigrants. So I thought it would be good to include this. This is called a poem by one named Shu from Shangshan, consoling himself. Over 100 poems are on the walls. Looking at them, they are all pining at the delayed progress. What can one sad person say to another? Unfortunate travelers everywhere wish to commiserate. Gain or lose, how is one to know what is predestined? Rich or poor, who is to say it is not the will of heaven? Why should one complain if he is detained and imprisoned here? From ancient times, heroes often were the first ones to face adversity. Here we are, years later, still dealing with the poetry of those new to America, facing adversity, overcoming struggles in other places like Poland, like Ukraine, like Central America and China. And it feels that one of the wonderful parts of the fabric of American poetry is that it's constantly expanding and including more voices.
Well, thank you, D.A. Powell. You and Cecilia have gotten us off to a great 2/3 of the reading, and I like what both of you have been saying, and it's very encouraging and enlightening to me and to those who are watching, I'm sure. Our next poet is Mary Ann McFadden. Mary Ann McFadden's first book, Eye of the Blackbird, won the 1995 Four-Way Books Intro Prize in Poetry. Devil Deer, McFadden's second book, was published in 2014 by the prestigious Alice James Books. In 2010, she was awarded a MacDowell Fellowship. McFadden taught English and poetry at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. Here's Mary Ann McFadden.
Okay. Thank you, Harry. I feel really honored to be asked to do this today. I'm not an academic. I did teach for a number of years, but it was mostly English as a second language. And then after I finally published my first book, they gave me an undergraduate poetry class. But I learned that most of the students were there because they thought it would be easier than regular English. So I didn't have a very enthused group, but it was still fun to try to challenge them and interest them. I was a little bit stymied by the question, Harry, because it just seemed so huge. And so I decided that the modern American poetry was too broad for me. And so I would just talk about poets that I keep returning to, poets that to me have been my foundation in poetry. I am quite envious of you, Cecilia, and your education in poetry, which was far better, far broader than mine in California grammar schools. We literally had nothing in poetry in grammar school. A little, of the Bowdlerized versions of Walt Whitman, nothing controversial, nothing nasty. So anyway, I started thinking about the question, and I didn't start writing till I was around 30. And because I too had some of the rebel in me, I didn't like a lot of the poetry that we were exposed to because it seemed, set in cement. It was the poems were inherited wisdom put in a beautiful form that you were supposed to respect and, imitate, I guess. And so in high school, we did read quite a bit of Walt Whitman, and I loved it. I loved it because he spoke much more the way I believed. Now, I have never told this in public, but my very first poem was in junior high, which is sort of I think Bill Matthews called it the acme of bad taste. I can't believe I'm saying this in public. It was called Ode to a Turd. And it was in rhymed couplets, quatrains, not couplets. And it had my classmates in hysterical stitches, and I loved it. I loved the attention, and I loved being bad. And there's part of me that still does. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, it's been lost. So anyway, I enjoyed Walt Whitman. Later on, when I started writing, I was desperate. I was just trying to stay alive. My mother was going crazy. My father was dying. I had been so without a creative outlet that that part of me had died. And so I was just grunting onto the page. It was like a wooden block trying to get words out. But boy, I loved it. And I got a little attention. I turned in a little manuscript to, it was a little writers' conference at American University, and I had to go. So I brought, and Bill Matthews asked to see it, and he took it home and he read it, and he came back, and he had it all crumpled up. It was rolled up, and he just said, these aren't too bad, he said. And then he said, but you've got a long ways to go. And I took that to mean that he saw potential, and the whole thing was very confusing. There was a man taking pictures of everybody and wandering around. And I thought he was the official photographer. It turned out to be William Stafford. Mm-hmm. And he finally read at the end, people weren't acting like I thought poets should act. Anyway, I started reading, and Cecilia, I didn't know that you met Carolyn Caiozzo. She was my great teacher.
I was 19 years old, and it's so different because I think my experience at some point kind of paralleled DA's, but for me, poetry was always something subversive. It was always something, except for some of those poems that I got in high school that like I said, I felt like Robert Frost was trying to teach me a lesson, and I wasn't sure. I wasn't, up for that. But yeah, meeting Carolyn Caiozzo when I was, 19 or 20 years old was just what I wanted to know.
Me too.
That the poet's life, that first of all, a poet could be alive, and that a poet's life, she lived a life that was, and she was a woman, and it was, it was still the 70s. it was still the 70s. It was like the later 70s looking at her.
That's about the time I started writing. Yeah.
Yeah, and that you could, that this was possible. It was possible to have that kind of agency and to write things that might piss people off.
Yes, hopefully.
So, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I loved her because she was so badass. But she was also really intimidating. But she turned me on to some of the great poets. I hadn't read a lot, as I said, at that point. So in trying to think of the central thrust of modern American poetry, I'm thinking, okay, the ones that I keep going back to are the ones I know about. So, of course, Carolyn taught Theodore Roethke. And and when you read him, you notice that in his first book, it's all iambic pentameter, the entire book. And then in the next book, he goes completely the other way. He goes, she taught this intentionally back to his childhood, trying to forget everything he knew, and wrote these poems in kind of baby talk language and stuff. But then at the end of all that, he wrote in a villanelle, one of the most beautiful villanelles in the language. And so I loved following his progression, from I think it was Yeats that said a poem should snap shut like a box, to the wide open poems of Roethke's later years. That was a progression that I enjoyed a lot. And so I'm jumping around here a little bit. So these were people like Walt Whitman, Hart Crane, Wallace Stevens, Carl Phillips, Mary Ann Baruch, and Mark Doty, who write so beautifully and from such a different place than the people I read in the very beginning. And it seems to me that poets have become much more less interested in inherited wisdom, in writing down the wise things they know, and more interested in language itself, in the way language can be used and what it can do, almost in a mystical sense. And I just want to read quickly a short poem by Muriel Rukeyser that I've always loved. It's called Poem, White Page, Poem. Yeah. And that's also the first line. Poem, white page, poem. Something is streaming out of a body in waves. Something is beginning from the fingertips. They are starting to declare for my whole life. All the despair and the making music. Something like wave after wave that breaks on a beach. Something like bringing the entire life to this moment. The small waves bringing themselves to white paper. Something like light stands up and is alive. And to me, the exciting things that are happening now in language are more like that, more that line. And as I read these poets again and again, I would hear things like syllabics. Well, what were syllabics? And then I started noticing Gary Snyder. And I began to see, and Carolyn Kaiser said this too. She said, poetry is a study of language. And
she must have a not great internet connection.
Well, we have about 4 minutes left. So I think, I'll just kind of say a couple of things here and then we each take a minute or two. Were you finished, Mary Ann? All of a sudden it just froze.
No, I wasn't quite.
Okay, finish.
I wanted to read just quickly something, Jane. I'll skip this, but his use of language, the counting syllables, and things like from How to Make Stew in the Pinacati Desert, that ends, dish it up and eat it with a spoon, sitting on a poncho in the dark. You know, those repeated fast beats, the excitement of them. I wanted to read something like Jane Hirschfield. She wrote a book on, the title of it is How Great Poems Transform the World. And I believe that great poems do that. And she's very early in the book, she says, language wakes up in the morning. It has not yet washed its face, brushed its teeth, combed its hair. It does not remember whether or not in the night any dreams came. Language goes to the tall mirror that hangs on one wall and stands before it, wearing no makeup, no slippers, no robe. And what she gets to is that we are language. She says, he says, the way a tree makes leaves, a pear tree makes pears, we make statements. And I think what we're getting to in poetry is, or in studies of language, and of which I think poetry is the cutting edge, is that it matters what we say. And again, this speaks to Gary Snyder and his talk of deep ecology, that
I think you said it at the end, it matters what we say. And, why don't we each take a minute to say what you would like to say about the reading, or what others have said, or something you may have forgotten to say. But I just want to say that you're all marvelous poets, Cecilia, D.A., Mary Ann. I love all your writing and your character. That's important to me, who you are, being who you are on the page. And also you help, an ordinary listener understand a little bit more about what poets think about, and not in an academic way. And you've demystified language and poetry and enlightened us. So thank you for that. So let's just start with Celia, D.A., and Mary Ann, and take about a minute and say something if you would like, and then we'll say thank you very much.
I loved hearing what DA and what Mary Ann had to say about this. This is fascinating. I only wish we had time for more crosstalk, which I love. But I think that, DA hit on something at the end of his presentation about the fact that, we are, if poetry is soul making, and if as American poets we're trying to make an American soul, then it's a never ending task because of these layers, because of these experiences of, different groups of immigrants being rejected, being assimilated, being the voice of American poetry is just so incredibly rich. I've spent, I really admire Polish poetry, and I've spent a lot of time with Polish poets and translators and thinking about and talking about the difference. And I'm sorry, I'm not a patriotic person, but I just think American poetry is the richest poetry there is. And because the voice is, because we have to be polyvocal, because there's such a richness of kind of soul making, and experience and voice and intonation and vernacular and all of that. It's just incredibly rich. So, DA, especially thanks for helping me kind of move that lens in that direction a little bit. It's really interesting for me to think about.
Thank you. And thanks to Mary Ann for bringing up Muriel Rukeyser, because to me, Rukeyser sort of epitomizes all that I cherish about American poetry. She does come from a place of privilege, but her father, lost his fortune in the Depression, and she had to put herself through school, and she had to go out and work as a journalist, and she put herself into places that made her uncomfortable and therefore willing to grow and learn. She took aviation lessons. She went to Barcelona and covered the People's Olympiad, which was, happening simultaneously with the Spanish Civil War. She went to Hanoi when it was still the war. She went to Korea, and she helped to push American poetry, to found organizations like PEN, to build bridges to other poetries around the world. And I think that that's one thing that's really important about American poetry, is that it's not isolationist the way America sometimes is. Poetry is sort of the opposite. We're always pushing to make it larger and more inclusive.
Mary Ann?
I loved hearing your personal stories, both of you, of how you came to poetry and how you first understand what you loved about it. And
Green Bush.
Yes. Yeah. And I think I remember being almost insulted when a
Mary Ann, I think we may have lost you again.
Wrote poems anymore. So I was kind of insulted, but of course I haven't forgotten it.
What were you insulted by? You were frozen, so we missed it completely.
Just that they thought the prose piece that I'd worked so hard on should have been a poem.
Who was they?
The judge of some competition, that the journalism class was forced to enter, and thank God I found poetry and Carolyn Kaiser early on, because it dispelled so many myths and encouraged me. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Mary Ann, D.A. Powell, and Cecilia. I appreciate your erudition and eloquence, and you certainly have lifted me up again. And so thank you very much. And here's our director, Jennifer Clymer.
Harry, thank you for making this space for us.
Yeah, yes. It's wonderful, Harry. Harry's Poetry Hour. It's one of the great things about Zoom.
It is.
100% agree. 100% agree. So, Harry, first of all, I want to thank all of your panelists, because it was an education, and it was an interesting opportunity to sit back and really think about not just poetry, but to have that kind of defined slice of this is what we're going to explore. And I think American poetry is that diverse because America is so diverse, because although we aren't always the melting pot that we should be, I think the poetry does reflect the aspiration of that. Okay, so Harry, in our last moments, tell us, what do we have to look forward to next week?
I will let one quick note, building on what Jennifer said. I think you both, all three of you, answered a question I've been thinking about lately, and that is, what should we be talking about when we talk about poetry? And I think all three of you have brought that forefront. And next Tuesday, we have two wonderful poets, Laurel Ann Bogan and Marie Powell Brown. So thank you very much once again, and thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank
We will
you.
see you guys back here next week at 1:00 for another installment of Harry's Poetry Hour.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thanks, Harry. Thanks, DA. Thanks,
Thanks,
Mary Ann. I miss you.
It's wonderful to get to spend time with all of you.